Imagine this. You're standing in your own backyard on a quiet Sunday afternoon. The smell of mesquite smoke is drifting off the grill, and the Texas sun is just starting to dip behind the oaks. And suddenly, three guys in polyester uniforms and plastic badges come storming onto your porch like they're the SWAT team, taking down a cartel. They weren't real cops, not even close, but they had these laminated citations and a level of arrogance that could fill a stadium, telling me they were there to seize my livestock and shut down a ranch that's been in my family for 3 generations. I'm Wyatt Miller, and these, in quote, HOA enforcement officers, in quote. We're about to find out the hard way that when you try to steal a man's legacy, you'd better make sure his family tree doesn't have a badge pinned to the top of it. See, what these clowns didn't in Oppos, T realize, what their boss, the Ice Queen developer next door, didn't in Oppos, T bother to check, is that my cousin Silas isn't just some relative I see at Christmas. He happens to be the high sheriff of this entire county, and he doesn't take kindly to people playing dress-up on his turf. My story doesn't start with that confrontation, though. It starts with the dirt under my fingernails and the 60 acres of rolling pasture I call the Ironwood Ranch, a place my granddaddy bought back in Oppos, 49, with every cent he'd saved while dodging bullets in the Pacific. This land is my soul. It's how I've raised my kids, and it's how I've made a damn good living selling grass-fed beef to people who actually care about where their food comes from. But about 4 years ago, the silence of the country got shattered when a developer bought the Ridge Line right next to us. They put up these massive cookie-cutter McMansions they called, in quote, the overlook at Cedar Crest, in quote, houses starting at $500,000 with white picket fences and neighbors who moved to the country for the, in quote, view, in quote, but then call the police the second they smell a cow or hear a rooster find its voice at dawn. The ringleader of this circus was a woman named Evelyn Vance, a real estate shark who'd moved down from Chicago with a wardrobe full of designer suits and a heart that felt like it had been carved out of a glacier. Evelyn didn't just want to manage her neighborhood. She wanted to, in quote, sanitize, in quote, the whole valley to drive up her property values. And since my ranch was the only thing standing between her and a perfect sterile landscape, she decided I was and quote, community nuisance, and quote, that needed to be erased. I remember the first time she stepped foot on my property. I heard her high heels clicking on my gravel driveway like a ticking time bomb, and before she even opened her mouth, that chemical, floral perfume of hers hit me like a physical punch, clashing so hard with the honest smells of hay and diesel fuel that even my lead mare, Bella, started pacing nervously in the corral. She handed me this glossy, multi-page document with a smirk that felt like an audit, telling me that because of some obscure, in quote, shared watershed agreement, in quote, her lawyers had cooked up, my independent ranch was now somehow under the jurisdiction of her HOA. She started rattling off violations. My 1965 John Deere tractor was, in quote, unsightly machinery, in quote. My original cedar post fencing was, in quote, substandard material, in quote. And my cattle were creating, in quote, inappropriate olfactory disturbances, in quote, which is just a fancy way of saying she didn't in Oppos, tea like the smell of a working farm. I tried to be a gentleman. I pulled out my original deeds and told her my family was here before her subdivision was even a blueprint, but she just adjusted her glasses and said, in quote, things evolve, Mr. Miller, and those who refuse to adapt usually find themselves very, very uncomfortable, in quote. And that was the moment I realized this wasn't Oppos, tea about rules. It was a shakedown. Within a month, the mail started coming every single day, $400 fines for the tractor, $300 fines for the fence, even a $200 daily fee for, in quote, noise pollution, in quote, because my cows had the audacity to moo at the moon. It was math designed to kill me, adding up to nearly $200,000 a year in fake fines. And I found out from a buddy in real estate that Evelyn was already showing maps of my property to hotel developers, acting like she already owned the place. She thought I was just some tired, middle-aged guy who'd roll over if she barked loud enough. But she forgot the one thing my granddaddy told me before he passed. And quote, Wyatt, bullies always count on good people being too exhausted to fight. So the minute you stop swinging is the minute you lose your dignity. End quote. That's when she sent in the, end quote, enforcement squad, end quote, led by a guy named Garrett Hobbs, a man-child with a Napoleon complex who looked like he'd been kicked out of every actual police academy in the state. He and his two buddies would cruise the perimeter of my ranch in these modified golf carts, wearing tactical vests and navy blue uniforms that squeaked every time they moved, waving around these in quote, official in quote, citations like they were the law of the land. The turning point came on a Tuesday when Garrett decided he was going to, in quote, impound in quote, my tractor. He actually hooked a heavy-duty chain to the back of his golf cart and tried to tow a 3-ton piece of American steel out of my barn. I just sat on the porch and watched because basic physics is a cruel mistress, and the second he hit the gas, the chain snapped taut, the rear of that golf cart lifted 3 feet off the ground, and Garrett went flying backward right into a fresh pile of what my cattle had left behind that morning. I was recording the whole thing, laughing so hard I could barely hold the phone steady, while Evelyn pulled up in her spotless Lexus, refusing to even step out of the car because she didn't into oppos. T want to ruin her shoes and then quote, filth and quote. She screamed through a cracked window that she had connections, that she'd have the EPA, the health department, and the IRS at my door by Monday, and she wasn't into oppos. T lying. The next week was a nightmare of government black SUVs, inspectors crawling over my land looking for, in quote, illegal slaughtering, in quote, or in quote, water contamination, in quote, that didn't in oppos. T exist, all triggered by anonymous tips she'd filed using her HOA letterhead. They even went after my kids, whispering to the school board that my ranch was and oppos. T a safe environment, which led to a call from my ex-wife that nearly broke my heart. She was terrified the kids would get caught in the crossfire of some federal raid she'd seen Evelyn talking about on the local news. I was at my breaking point, sitting in my kitchen with a mountain of legal papers and a feeling of pure, cold isolation when I realized I'd been fighting this with my hands tied behind my back because of my own stupid pride. See, my cousin Silas and I hadn't into oppos. T spoken in 3 years. We'd had a blowout at a family funeral over some landline dispute that seemed so small now, and I'd been too stubborn to ask for help while my world was burning down around me. But then my sister called and told me Silas had been asking about the, in quote, fake cops, in quote, he'd heard were harassing ranchers in the valley, and I realized that while I was defending my dirt, he was defending the law, and we were fighting the same enemy from different sides of a fence I'd built out of spite. I swallowed my pride and called him that night, and the second he picked up, the years of silence just evaporated. He told me, in quote, Wyatt, I've been waiting for you to realize you can't fight a snake by yourself. Now bring me everything you've got. End quote. We spent the next 48 hours in his office, and what we found was enough to send Evelyn Vance to prison for a long, long time. It turns out the Cedar Crest HOA was never actually incorporated with the state, meaning every cent she'd collected, every fine she'd issued, and every, in quote, enforcement, in quote, action she'd taken was a felony act of fraud and impersonation. She wasn't into oppos. T just a mean neighbor. She was running a racketeering operation, using fake government letterhead to trigger inspections so she could bankrupt ranchers and flip their land for a profit. The end came on a Friday morning. Evelyn and her, in quote, squad, in quote, showed up on my porch one last time. Garrett was wearing a new, even more ridiculous tactical belt, and Evelyn was holding a, in quote, property seizure notice, in quote, she'd printed herself. She started her usual speech about community standards, but she stopped mid-sentence when 3 real, black and white sheriff cruisers came flying up my driveway, dust clouds choking out the smell of her perfume. Silas stepped out of the lead car, looking every bit the high sheriff in his tan Stetson, and the look on Evelyn's face when he put those real steel cuffs on her wrists was a masterpiece of cinematic justice. Garrett tried to argue his way out of it, claiming he had, in quote, delegated authority, end quote, but Silas just looked at his plastic badge and said, end quote, son, the only thing you're authorized to do is remain silent before I add resisting arrest to your list of problems. End quote. We found out later that Evelyn had defrauded over a dozen families in 3 counties, stealing nearly $3 million in fees and property equity, and now she's trading her designer suits for a bright orange jumpsuit while my ranch is finally quiet again. The neighbors at Cedar Crest ended up suing her estate. The, in quote, fake police, in quote, are facing years for impersonation, and Silas and I are back to having Sunday dinner together, the way it was always supposed to be. But here's the thing that still keeps me up at night. Evelyn almost won, She had the money, the media, and the, in quote, authority, in quote, all lined up, and if I had an oppos, T made that one phone call. If I'd stayed too proud to ask for help, the Ironwood Ranch would be a parking lot for a boutique hotel right now. It makes me wonder how many other people are out there right now, being bullied by someone with a fancy title and a loud voice, feeling like they're all alone in the fight. We like to think the law is this big, untouchable thing, but sometimes the law is just a piece of paper until someone with a little bit of grit stands up and says, in quote, no more, in quote. So I've got to ask you, have you ever dealt with a, in quote, neighborhood dictator, in quote, or an HOA that thought they were the Supreme Court? Do you think I was right to involve family to settle a score, or should I have kept fighting it out in the civil courts on my own? Some people say I got lucky because of who my cousin is, but I say justice is justice, no matter whose name is on the badge. Drop a comment and tell me your horror stories. I want to know if the world is getting crazier or if we're just finally starting to push back.